Welcome, everyone, to this week's lesson on the essentials of Maharishi Jaimini's Upadesha Sutras. This is our second lesson, and a very important one, because today we're going to be learning about both the calculation and how to use the primary predictive tool that K.N. Rao uses in his approach to seeing events in the Jaimini system, referred to as Chara Dasha, and you had a little bit of exposure to this in the last lesson. But today we're going to see his specific calculation of that, and then I'm going to show you a very step-by-step systematic methodology for applying that dasha in order to see what a particular sign-based Chara dasha can potentially bring for an individual. But before we get started with that, as always, I'm going to, as you saw last week, begin these lessons with some Sanskrit prayers, invoking the blessing of the divine. So you now should be seeing this document. We're going to be starting with this one here. First, an invocation to Ganesha, of course, the Vedic deity of, patron deity of Jyotish, and also the remover of obstacles. So I'll begin. Om Garanam Tva Ganapatigun Havamahe, Priyanam Tva Priyapatigun Havamahe, Nidinam Tva Nidipatigun Havamahe, Vaso Mama Aham Yani, and then secondarily, I want to invoke the blessing of the Guru. I'm having, of course, in mind my Jyotish Guru, K.N. Rao. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshvara, Guru Reva Brahma, Tasmahe Shri Guruve Namah, Tasmahe Shri Guruve Namah. And then lastly, a prayer that we have good learning experience together. Ohom Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Obunaktu, Sahaviryam Karvavahe, Tejasvina Vaditamastu, Ma Vidvishavahe, Ohom Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Okay, so now we'll begin our lesson, and let me pull up another document. So, a calculation of Chara Dasha according to K.N. Rao. I mentioned that there are many sign-based dashas that are utilized in the Jaimini system. Same thing with planetary dashas in the Parashari system. But Chara, sometimes I think referred to just as the Rashi dasha in the sutras themselves. I like to think of it as the counterpart to Vimshotri in the Parashari system, in the sense that it's an all-purpose dasha, which is to say it can be used to predict any event, and it's an unconditional dasha, meaning it can be applied to any chart. So Chara is to the Jaimini system, at least in K.N. Rao's approach, as Vimshotri is to the Parashari system. And, in the usual way in which we talked about Sanskrit treatises on Jyotish are organized, all those foundational concepts that you've now read about in the first Adhyaya, first Pada, are laid out. And among them are some general rules with regards to determining the length of sign-based dashas. And, you saw these sutras in the last lesson, where, generally speaking, when it's an odd sign, to calculate the variable length of a dasha that's an odd sign, you're going to be counting from that sign inclusively to wherever its lord is forward in the zodiac, and the reverse for even signs. But then this very important sutra, 1127, that says not applicable in all cases. And it talks about how, of course, if you got a sign-based dasha, then it's going to be 12 major periods, and then within that, 12 sub-periods, one for each sign. So then it becomes a very important question, in which case is the counting forward in the case of odd signs and the counting backwards in the case of even signs, when is that not applicable? And actually it's not until later in the sutras that we get any information about that. It comes in this sutra that you see here, where it says that the counting is forward in the zodiac for the two even signs, Taurus and Scorpio, and backward for the zodiacal two odd signs, Leo and Aquarius. So this is the reverse of the general principle, as you can see. And you maybe have immediately registered with you that these are the fixed signs of the zodiac. This is the easiest way to remember those. And so with regards to this important principle of whether we're counting forward or backwards in order to determine the variable length of a sign-based Chara Dasha, how do you remember this? Well, one way of remembering it here is to understand that the zodiac can divide itself into 4 quarters that are referred to in the sutras as odd-footed quarters or even-footed, not to be confused with odd and even signs. What's meant by that is that, the first quarter, consisting of the first 3 signs of the zodiac, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, the counting is going to always be forward when determining the length. Now, in the case of the second quarter, Cancer, Leo, and Virgo, it's going to be backwards. And for also the third quarter, again, it's going to be an odd-footed quarter. It's going to be forward. And then for the fourth quarter, even-footed quarter, then it's going to be backwards. So this is the thing that has to be kept in mind. And then the last piece of the puzzle comes in yet another sutra, and actually a different section of the sutra, more about that in a minute, where it says that to determine whether, well, first of all, you'll see the statement here in the italicized English, that the last part of the statement is, the dasha begins with the sign of the ascendant. That's the easy part of Chara Dasha. You just simply have to remember it always begins with whatever is the sign of the lagna of the birth chart. But then to determine the all-important issue of whether you're going to then, the dashas are going to progress in a regular order within the zodiac or go backwards, you have to see that by seeing which sign is the 9th sign from the birth lagna. And if it's one of those odd-footed group, then it's going to go direct or order of dasha. If it's one of those even-footed group, it's going to go indirect. Now, the question might be raised, it certainly was raised for me, as to why these different components of how Chara Dasha are calculated, why do they appear in different portions of the Jaimini Sutras themselves. K.N. Rao's answer to that is that this was not uncommon in these texts because it became a way of, you might say, protecting the knowledge from the uninitiated or, those who might misuse it, and that you'd never really be able to piece this together without the aid of a teacher. But this particular approach is then confirmed because much more elaborate information is given about this more in a systematic way, all in one place, in the calculation given for Chara Dasha in the Brihat Parashahora Shastra, which as I said before, I think is much a compilation that took place much later than when the Jaimini Sutras were authored. So, one of the first things to determine, as we talked about, is once you realize that the dasha starts with the sign on the ascendant, then the first thing, step number 1 here, is to determine which direction it's going to go in, forward in the zodiac or backwards. And, I talked about how that gets determined. I believe there's an easy way and a simple way to remember this, which is what I'm going to show you now. If you're familiar with the South Indian style chart, it's got 4 corners. And if you realize that the signs that are part of the lower right corner, which would be Leo, Virgo, and Libra, they're always going to go direct if they're the sign on the ascendant. Conversely, the 3 signs in the upper left-hand corner, which are going to be Aquarius, Pisces, and Aries, if they are the sign of the ascendant, well, then they're also always going to be direct. The dasha is going to go, if it starts with Pisces, it's going to go to Aries and so on. If it starts with Virgo, it's going to follow by Libra and so on. And so this is the simple way that I remember. It takes away this idea of having to see the 9th sign from and remembering whether it's the odd foot or the even foot. This is the shortcut as I see it. And so, you might find it useful that way. So after we've determined, number 1, where does it start? Sign on the ascendant. Is the dasha going to progress forward or backwards? The next step here, as you see here, is to calculate the length of each period. And this, again, is not difficult. We do that by counting from the sign to wherever the Lord is inclusively, and then subtracting 1. But then the big thing to remember, am I counting forward or am I counting backwards? The easiest dasha and length to see is when the Lord of the sign is in the sign, because then it gets a full 12 years. So if you've got Venus in Taurus or Libra and you come to that sign, well, it's going to be 12 years. If you have Mars in either Aries or Scorpio, its own sign, well, I shouldn't say Scorpio, Aries. We'll come to Scorpio in a minute. It's going to be 12 years. And otherwise, the length of the dasha is going to be anywhere from 1 to 11 years. And how does this get determined then? Then you have to come back to this quartering of the zodiac into these two groups of 3 that are labeled odd-footed and the 2 groups of 3 that are labeled even-footed. And you see them here. So, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, if you're creating you're trying to determine the length of each of those, you're going to be counting forward to the Lord. If you have the signs Cancer, Leo, and Virgo, which is the 2nd quarter, and then the 4th quarter, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, when you're going to determine the length of those, you're going to count to the Lord in reverse order, -1. So that's how each of the most signs are determined in terms of their length, how many years of that dasha. Now, the trickiest part of calculation of Chara dasha has to do is that when you come to either the sign Scorpio or the sign Aquarius, the reason is that in this dasha, the lord of those signs, there's 2 lords of those signs. In the case of Scorpio, both Mars and Ketu, and then in the case of Aquarius, both Saturn and Rahu. And there then are some simple rules for how we determine the length of this particular dasha. First of all, as Kane Rao would say, if they're both at home, if they're both in the sign itself, say Mars and Ketu's in Scorpio or Saturn and Rahu's in Aquarius, it becomes easy again. You take the full 12 years for that sign. And then if one's in the sign, but the other's not in the sign, as he would say, you take the one not at home. So Mars is in Scorpio, but Ketu isn't, you count to Ketu. If Saturn's in Aquarius, but Rahu isn't, you're going to count to Rahu, and vice versa. But say both of them are not in their signs. How do we do it then? Well, you see which one has the most conjunctions, the most associations, planets in the sign with it, and you determine that way. But what if they have an equal number? What happens then? Then his statement is that you take the taller of the 2, meaning you'd see which is higher in degrees, and then you would take that one. So again, concrete example, you have Saturn Aquarius, both ruling Aquarius, both are not in the sign, both have the equal number of associations. Saturn's degrees are higher than Rahu's, then I'm going to count to Saturn. So this is how we determine that, and that's what you always have to keep in mind when you're looking at the length of either Scorpio or Aquarius. Now you might say, well, doesn't the programs do all this for me? And the answer is yes, but I think anyone who's going to become proficient in using this dasha needs to understand what goes into its calculation, how it's derived. For number one, so you can check the programs such that you're getting the calculation according to K and Rao's method, because there's an important point here I need to make. If you look at how this dasha is given in Parashara, there is this idea that for signs containing either an exalted or debilitated planet, that you either add a year to the calculation of the sign containing the exalted planet, and you subtract a year from the sign containing a debilitated planet. Well, Kane Rao says, his method is not to take these. He doesn't feel that it gives correct results. And in my 23 years of experience now, I feel the same way. I believe that this calculation Chara dasha will give you very good results, as has given me. And, one of the just logical arguments about that is that if you use that method, there's going to be instances where there's no dasha of, meaning, think about Sagittarius. You're trying to calculate the length of that and say the calculation, the counting is going to be direct because Sagittarius is among that odd-footed group. It's in the 3rd quadrant. But then, if it's in Jupiter's in Capricorn, it's sign of debilitation, you're going to count inclusively from Sagittarius 1, 2. You're going to make the usual subtraction of 1 year, and then if you take another subtraction for the fact that Jupiter's debilitated, you're going to end up with 0 length for the Sagittarius period. That is, you're going to have no Sagittarius dasha, which just didn't seem right to K and Rao, and so he started researching on that basis, and he felt that this principle should not be used in the calculation of Chara dasha, and so that's not what I'm teaching either. And so, putting it all together here, I'm looking at the chart of the great yoga master Paramahansa Yogananda here. And so, based on what you've heard, we just want to walk through then the calculation of some of his major periods in Chara Dasha, which, as I mentioned, can be done mentally. Ken Rao used to say you should be able to calculate Chara Dasha, at least the major periods mentally, just by walking down the road and doing it in your head. And I've found that when you're doing some mindless chores like I don't know, mowing your lawn or doing your laundry or something like that, and you want to be thinking about a chart and you don't have your computer in front of you, you can think about a chart that way. I'm sure you do this sort of thing yourself, but then also just do it dynamically and seeing what major period might apply to this person. And with just a little bit of practice, this can be done very easily mentally. In fact, one of the exercises I'm going to recommend to you is take 5 charts and calculate the major periods in Chara Dasha up to the person's current age. Do it pen and paper first, but then see if you just can't do it mentally. In this case here, so we know what? Where's Chara Dasha going to start? Just think about what you've heard from me. Hopefully you remember. It's going to start with the sign of the ascendant, which of course for him is Leo. And then the next thing, okay, how's it going to progress? Is it going to go Leo Virgo, direct order? Is it going to go Leo Cancer, indirect order? That's the next things that have to be determined. Now, it's in one of those signs that's in the lower right-hand corner of the South Indian style chart, which I said is my shortcut for remembering this. But if you're doing it more the long way, you'd look at the sign 9th from Leo, which is Aries, and you'd see which group, odd-footed or even-footed, it's in. Since it's in odd-footed group, then you'd realize the counting is, the order of the dasha is also going to be direct, which it is in this case. In other words, his first major period is going to be Leo, his second major period is going to be Virgo, and so on. Next, we want to see the length of each of these dashas, in which case we look to see how far the Lord has gone, but then we have to see, are we going to see that directly in the zodiac, or are we going to see that in reverse? And again, we were going to need to remember that Leo is actually one of those fixed signs where the general principle of it counting forward is not going to apply. It's going to be in the reverse. So actually we have to count backwards in the zodiac to wherever the sun is, Lord of Leo, and subtract 1. And so if we count backwards, we see that it's 9 signs away, minus 1. So his Leo period is going to be 8 years long. Takes him up to age 8. And then, of course, we saw that the order of the dasha is going to be direct, so we come to Virgo, which again is in the second quarter, even-footed quarter. So we're going to count in reverse to wherever the Lord Mercury is. In this case, if we count in reverse to where Mercury is in Sagittarius, it's 10 years minus 1, right? So it's going to be 9, 9 and 8. Of course, it's going to be 17. It takes them up to age 17. And this is how we calculate Chara Dasha. I'm going to just do one more. I don't want to belabor the point here, spend a lot of time on calculation. Just want you to be able to get the point here. So we come to Libra, which is the next sign in the progression directly in the zodiac. And again, we look for the Lord, but now we've come into an odd-footed group, the group of Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius, and we're going to count directly in the zodiac from wherever Venus is from here. It's 1, 2, Libra, Scorpio, and then minus 1. The Libra period is only going to be 1 year. So this is how we calculate Chara Dasha. And this is what you'll see in the document. And so, seeing now in a table all his major periods, you'll see how this goes here. And then we come to the idea of, well, how then do we calculate subperiods? Again, it's rather easy in the sense that the subperiod in length is always going to be proportional to the major period. So say, for example, the Lord of the sign is in the sign, then you get a full 12 years of the dasha. Now the subperiods are going to be each 1 month apiece, right? Full year, each of the 12 subperiods, 1 month. If a length of a dasha is 11 years, well, then each of the subperiods is going to be 11 months. 6 years, 6 months, just like that. And then you also have to determine the order of the subperiods. The order of the subperiods, the simple rule for doing this is that whatever is the order of the dashas for the major periods, that if it was direct or indirect, is going to be the order of the subperiods. The simple thing you have to remember, though, is that, you know how in Vimshotri, the first subperiod is the subperiod of the planet itself. So if you're running Jupiter, first subperiod is the subperiod of Jupiter. Here, the first subperiod is the next sign in whatever order that you're going. So, you know, if it's the direct order and you're running the major period of Leo, the first subperiod is going to be Virgo, and the last subperiod is going to be the subperiod of the sign itself. In other words, Leo, Leo. And again, you know, when you get this document and you can go through this, you'll understand. But so here's an example of that. See that the major period is Aries, and the order is going to be in the order of the zodiac. The order of the progression of the dasha was direct. Then the first subperiod within Aries is going to be Taurus. The last subperiod is going to be Aries, Aries. Where you have a order of the dasha that's indirect, say with Taurus, then the first subperiod is going to be the sign in reverse, which is Aries, and then the last subperiod is going to be the sign of the major period itself, Taurus, Taurus. So again, you'll see examples of this. I don't want to spend too much time on just explaining this calculation. Our programs do give this, but I'm really encouraging students to be able to understand and calculate themselves, either paper and pen or just mentally, at least the major periods within Chara Dasha. At the very minimum, understand what the calculation is based on. And probably the most important thing is to see if the program that you're using, whatever that is giving you the calculation as it's explained here, not taking, you know, an additional year for signs containing exalted planets, not subtracting an additional year for signs containing a debilitated planet. So now we want to talk about, you know, the interesting, the fun part, which is, well, how do I actually use this dasha? So I'm now going to lay out a systematic set of guidelines for how we use any sign-based, you know, Jaimini sign-based dasha, not just Chara, but starting with Chara here. And let's begin with the idea that, you know, every planet, you know, every graha, when it's connected to a sign, say it's in that sign, or say it's aspecting that sign, it's going to yield an influence at 3 different levels. Now, the first level is something you should be very familiar with, just the level of, is that graha classified as a natural benefic or a natural malefic? This is just the simple, most basic yoga in Jyotish, Shubha Ashubha yoga, with the influence of the natural benefic, with the influence of the natural malefic. This is the first thing that you want to register in your mind. You know, for example, you know, Jupiter and Venus, obviously the 2 best natural benefics. Are they in the house? Or, you know, are Mars and Saturn there, the 2 most challenging natural malefics? And so you're just seeing this influence of natural benefics or malefics. You know, what you do with that is something I'm going to go more on to talk about here. In a very general way, signs occupy, all right, are going to tend to give better, more favorable results, and signs containing natural malefics are likely to yield less, you know, favorable results, more challenging, difficult results. As a very general rule, you know, we'll see, as there always is in Jyotish, exceptions to that, particularly if, say, Mars and Saturn have a very good dignity and own sign are exalted, and if they're karakas that, you know, can give certain kind of desirable results, like career-wise. We'll see that. So the next level of the way in which we think about grahas influencing a sign is based on its, you might say, natural indications, right? And so what I mean by this is that we all know that Venus is the natural significator of love and love relationships. Jupiter is the natural significator of children. And so this is another way in which we're thinking about when we see a graha influencing a sign that we're trying to interpret what kind of results will this particular sign dasha bring. If, for example, the sign contains Venus, well, could be a time when a person could marry or get involved in a love relationship, or, be involved in artistic pursuits, have a well-developed aesthetic sense during this time. In other words, all the sort of natural significations of Venus, good vehicles, in the Jewish system. Vahanas, or vehicles, are ruled by Venus, all these natural significations. And likewise, if Jupiter there, it could be, if it's the right time of life for a person, could be a time when they could have a child simply because they're running the major period of some planet containing Jupiter, or even Jupiter in aspect, as we'll see. So you've got first Shubha Ashubha Yoga, natural malefics influence, and then what are the natural significations of a planet that's in a sign, or likewise aspecting a sign. Now, the third level of influence of a graha is one that I exposed you to in last week's lesson, based on a planet becoming a specific Chara Karaka for a specific chart. So, a planet that becomes the one with the second highest degrees, whether it's a natural benefic or malefic, or what its natural significations are. I was showing how when a person runs that sign, or from where that AMK falls 10th from there, can be a period that can raise a person up professionally, right? So 3 levels of meaning are the natural benefics, malefics. What are their karaka significations, natural karaka significations? And finally, what are their chara karaka indications? That is, what kind of karaka specifically in the Jaimini system that they become, and what might that suggest about what this period can bring as a result. So that's the grahas and their 3 levels of influence. Step 1, whenever you're seeing that a person's running a particular dasha of some sign, the first thing I suggest that you look for is what house is that sign in that specific chart, first from the birth logna, right? So I'm showing you here the chart of the movie star, originally TV star, Johnny Depp, okay? And you think about how his Chara Dasha would progress. It's going to start with Cancer, but because it's one of those even-footed signs, in the second quadrant, the Dasha is going to progress in reverse, right? And you're going to count to the moon, and again, you're going to count in reverse. So the first period of his Chara Dasha Cancer is going to be, it's 8 signs away. You're going to subtract 1. It's going to be 7 years. Then he's going to run Gemini, in which case the counting is going to be direct because it's one in the odd-footed. You're going to count to the Lord, Mercury, which is 12 signs away, minus 1. It's going to be 11 years. So now he's starting to get in his late teens, early 20s, right, when he runs his Taurus period. Well, you see, Taurus is his 11th house. So just based on, and it contains 2 benefics, right? One strong in its own sign. So just based on that, the 11th house is the house of honors and awards, right? It's the house of gains of all kinds, right? It's one of those prosperity houses. Just based on seeing that he's running his Taurus period, and it happens to be his 11th house, and it just happens to contain 2 natural benefics, one that's strong in its own sign, and it actually happens to contain his AMK, which I believe goes to its own sign Leo in Navamsha. Then you could start to put these things together and see that this is going to be, a pretty good, favorable period for Johnny Depp. But just starting with the idea, not even, considering what grahas are influencing, just starting with the idea that it's his 11th house, and it contains, 2 natural benefics, one strong in its own sign. Now, I'm going to be showing you a chart here that is kind of a very interesting situation. He approached me for a consultation back in early 2013, if I recall. He was an Indian man living in Nepal at the time. And he was in his mid-30s. And I discovered in our conversation that he had never really been in any kind of serious relationship, and actually never even dated anyone. But his main question was, what are my marital prospects? Will I marry? And if so, when? And so I'm looking at this in the Jaimini system, and I noticed that starting in, I think, late 2015, early 2016, he was going to be moving into the major period of Sagittarius. So the first thing I'm doing, step 1, which house from the birth logna is Sagittarius? Well, you can see it's his 7th house. Next thing I'm going to notice is Mars is there, natural malefic, right? But also it's the decay of this particular chart, planet with the lowest degrees representing spouse. So entering a dasha of a sign associated with the seventh house containing the decay. Well, then I realized, based on my experience, this could be a period when he's going to marry. Now, the period, how long is it going to be? Well, we're going to count to the Lord Jupiter, and we're going to count direct because it's one of those odd-footed signs. And so counting from there, it's going to go 8 minus 1. So the length of this dasha is going to be 7 years. And then I sort of dialed into some sub-periods that, showed this additional potential. Make a long story short, I made a prediction that he could marry as early as April of 2006, or spring, I think I said. It was a more general time frame. And I got word from him, early part of 2016 that he was engaged, and he did then marry in April of 2016. This is, again, what I mean by how sometimes in the Jaimini system, just based on a very simple picture, one can make a prediction. Now, I substantiated and you might say corroborated that prediction by looking at it in different ways and in the Parashari point of view, but also using transits. But really, the basis of the prediction was in the Jaimini system based on what I was showing you here. Last week in the lesson, you saw the chart of this woman here, where I talked about that I predicted childbirth when she moved into Capricorn period, simply because Capricorn is her fifth house, but then also because it contains her PK, planet with the fifth highest degrees, which is representing men, children. So the first thing we're looking at is the house. Here again, I think I showed you this chart last week, Franklin Roosevelt, who suffered a major, illness, critical health issue that left him paralyzed for life when he ran his Aquarius period, sixth house from his birth chart, but also containing his GK. So you saw this last week. And then also, Donald Trump here, that I want to spend a little bit more time with in terms of, that system that I'm walking you through. And to do that, I'm going to change screen and bring up a larger chart here. Okay, you should be seeing in a moment when the program responds. There it is. You should be seeing this chart of Donald Trump with the karakas listed in the chart. And, everyone knows now that he became president, but of course, before that, he, after being a very successful real estate mogul, also then became a, big TV star, reality TV star that really, made him more of a worldwide known celebrity. All of this has happened in his major period of Gemini. And again, first thing we'd want to see is which house from the birth lagna is Gemini. It's the 11th house, right? And house of gains again, house of honors and awards, house of victory, right? And then one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that if you want to start to do a little more sophisticated analysis, you'd also see which sign this is, which house this is from the Karakamsha Lagna, that special Lagna that I introduced you to last week. And then, you remember that his Karakamsha Lagna is Virgo, in which case Gemini becomes the 10th house from there. And, what do we see there? We see, first of all, Mercury, who's a natural benefic, but then we see that it's also strongly placed. It has a good dignity, strong in its own sign. And then, we would also see that, the aspects that it gets, the only aspect it gets is that of another natural benefic, who is Jupiter. And I talked about this a little the last time. And just these factors alone, the fact that it's 11th house from the birth lagna, and it's the 10th house from Karakamsha lagna, that it contains a natural benefic, that natural benefic strong in its own sign, that it also gets the influence of another natural benefic with no influence of natural malefics. This, kind of starts to create a picture of a very highly favorable, period. Just those factors alone. And then, you could get a little bit more sophisticated about it and say, well, that Mercury is the MK. So what does the NK represent? I told you it represents all the significations of the fourth house. And of course, she's continued to be enormously successful in real estate during this period, which would be a fourth house signification. Now he's living in the White House. When you become president, you get to live in a very famous special house, which, the White House. So another fourth house signification, your residence, where you live. And of course, he's been living in palaces most of his life, but particularly in this Gemini period. You can even, this is 2020 hindsight, but, you can see how things are playing out here. Jupiter, who makes a glance, Rashi Drishti onto this, is the BK, like unto the third house of performance. And it was in this Gemini period that he started becoming a performer, this reality TV star. And quite frankly, if you ask me, I thought his whole presidential campaign was quite a performance. And what are you always doing then as the campaign manager? You're campaigning for president. You're constantly giving speeches, which is one of the natural significations of Mercury. And the BK represents all matters related to the third house, which is, short distance travel. So, he spent a good portion of the last, year or more campaigning for president, where he was continuously giving speeches and he was continually making, short trips here and there, one-day trips here and there all over the country in order to do that. And you see how this gets reflected. And so the factors related to his Gemini major period, just to give you a feel for that. Okay, I'm just going to stop share again, bring up my document again. So first step is just seeing that which house it is. Second step is to note the influence of just those natural benefics, natural malefics that I've been talking about. And, as I said, in a general sort of way, when these natural benefics, particularly if they have a good dignity, own sign, exaltation sign, but even if they maybe have other sources of strength by virtue of being involved in exchange, even directional strength, Vargotama in particular, when these natural benefics fall in a sign that you're running this dasha or aspected, this can be a especially favorable indication for that. And conversely, even well-placed malefics can be a better influence if they have a good dignity. As I talked about, exalted malefics, or those in their own sign, may actually give some favorable results. But generally speaking, you're looking at Shubha-Ashubha yoga. Now, going back to the chart then again of Johnny Depp, I spoke about this a little, and it was actually during this period that he first became a TV star, appearing at quite a young age in that TV series 21 Jump Street. So that happened. Oops, what did I do here? Well, excuse me. I lost my page. I'm sorry. Just give me a moment here. Okay, here I am again. So there's a lot going on here with regards to his Taurus period. We talked about the level of natural benefics, natural malefics. And then the level of Karaka significations, where you see Venus here in his own sign. Johnny Depp, after he dropped out of high school, he was actually encouraged, I think, by one of his teachers because he was demonstrating a lot of musical talent, and he had the opportunity to, he was starting a band, and they had the opportunity to start touring. In other words, he became his first artistic type of pursuit in this Taurus period was, as a musician. Of course, Venus is the natural signification of that. But now we'll go to another level of how we're looking at each of the grahas. We see here that the DK is there, planet with the lowest degrees indicating spouse. And if, you see, because the Taurus period is going to be a full 12 years, right? It has its Lord. If you looked at, what happened to him during those 12 years, that's when he first married. But then we see the AMK there. Remember that principle? And actually the combination, as we'll see when we study Jaimini Raja yogas, of the AMK and the DK here is a Jaimini Raja yoga. And so this is where this is the time period where he first became a star. So I'm just kind of showing you the different steps here of how we would think about a particular, and what we're always also looking for is when we're seeing grahas in a sign, we want to see, their dignity. Do they have some source of strength? But you also want to look for that in the Navamsha as well. I just showed you the chart of Johnny Depp where he becomes a star in his Taurus period. Of course, one of the natural significations of the sun is stardom, is celebrity, which happens to be his AMK here. But if we see his Navamsha, we'll see in Navamsha that then the sun also is in its own sign, so it has a source of strength. And by the way, just this idea about seeing what house it is, if you look at when he married for the second time, which actually proved to be something of disaster, it happened in his Capricorn major period, which is the seventh house of his birth chart. If you look at the timing of when he had another period that proved to be, particularly favorable for him after Taurus was, of course, if you keep going in the progression of the zodiac backwards, another period you're going to come to Pisces, which now it's containing Jupiter, strong in its own sign, right? And Jupiter as the BK, of course, which has to do with all the significations of the third house, which, of course, has to do with acting. And it was during this major period that a couple of things happened of note, one of which was he had children. And this could have been seen just by the fact that he's running a Rashi containing the natural significations of Jupiter, strongly placed here, which of course is children. But you'd also find and see that his, probably the role which he's gotten the most famous for, that has brought him the most, you might say, just fame and also compensation, his kind of salary for the movies that he's making are, of course, the role of Captain Jack Sparrow in the Pirate of the Caribbean series of movies. And if I'm just going from memory here, but I'm fairly certain they happened in the Pisces period, which was, again, a fairly long period. It's going to be 12 years because the Lord of the sign is in the sign, right? So, again, just kind of giving you a feel for this. Let me show you here the another step that you'd want to take here. I've kind of gone through 4 steps. Another step you're going to want to take here relates to something you learned, a special aspect of the Jaimini system, which is the use of padas. So in the systematic methodology that I'm showing you here, and you can go through yourself when you see the document, I'm calling step 5, is that for any sign period that you're examining, you want to see which pada, if any pada, it is also relates to. And, your programs, you're seeing a screen here that my program will calculate all these for you. You want to make sure you have the option that says no exceptions. Remember that idea, or you're going to get data different than the kind that Kay and Rao and I used to make these determinations. So this is something you want to see. So going back to when he ran his Taurus period, since the Lord of the sign is in the sign, Taurus is both his 11th house, but it's also, they're using the word A here, Aruda, would be the pada of the 11th, but it's also the pada lagna itself, as I talked about, very, very favorable with those 2 benefics, one in its own sign, and an AMK that gets strengthened in the Navamsha by being in its own sign. So that was significant in of itself. Now, looking at Trump's chart again, if you look at the timing of when he first married his first wife, Ivana, it would have been in his Sagittarius period. And if you calculate the pada of his 7th house, you'll see that it comes out to be Sagittarius. How do we do this? We put our finger on Aquarius, his 7th house, find the Lord and how far it's gone away from there, counting always forward in the zodiac for padas. You'll see it's gone 6 signs away, counting inclusively. If you count 6 more from its placement in Cancer, you come to Sagittarius. Sagittarius becomes eligible for giving him marriage because it's the pada of the 7th house. So this is another step and another level of analysis that you're going to want to do when you're looking at what a particular sign period can bring in Chara Dasha. And then lastly, not lastly, but another step, 6th step, is to see Argala. because this is a new concept, and every sign, every point in the chart, you can see what might be the argala with regards to that particular sign. And if it gets favorable argala, and it maybe has planets that are containing Raja Yogas, or maybe containing the AMK. If additionally there is argala, well, that's a good thing. That's a beneficial thing. So now, if you look at Bill Gates' chart, it was from the period from 1982 to 1990. This coincided with the rise of Microsoft, its dominance in the PC operating system and applications software market. And as a result, it was during this time that he became extremely wealthy. Well, I think we showed you this last week. If you put your finger on Sagittarius and you look at argala from there, you'd look at the 4th, which has the moon, but then there are 2 planets in the 10th from there, so that is obstruction. And if you look at the 2nd house from there are no planets. But if you look at the 11th house from there, then you see an exalted Saturn, Venus in its own sign, and then also the Sun getting Nichabanga. And so one of the explanations, and I think I shared this last time, as to why the Sagittarius period proves so beneficial, it also has these argalas, and then it has that special Trikona argala that I was talking about, where you have a natural benefic Jupiter by itself in the 9th from there, while the 5th from there, Aries, is vacant. So some very, very favorable argala relating to the Sagittarius period. And of course, the 10th house there becomes very strong. The 11th house from there becomes very strong, which is why he became a billionaire during this period. And so you can look at this. Also, the chart of Drew Barrymore. Again, I might have mentioned this again last week. I talked about, what happens to argala to Taurus from Pisces, and then also the 2nd house from her 10th house, Aquarius. I think I gave these examples last week, so I'll skip through those. One that we may not have seen is, consider the chart of Catherine the Great here in terms of certain periods. So, if you look just from her Lagna here, right, then you've got Mercury forming an argala from there. There are no planets because we're not counting Rahu and Ketu. I think that's not why I was seeing this here. Oh, actually, what I wanted to do is to see argala from Taurus, right? Because I believe it was from Taurus. It was that period that she actually became the monarch of Russia. Sorry for my confusion here. I wanted you to see the argala from Taurus, in which case you've got 3 grahas, including 2 natural benefics in the 2nd from there. Now you've got 2 in the 12th from there too, which there are more in the 2nd, so the argala still remains reflective. And you've got a planet in the 11th from there without any. We have no planets in the 3rd from there because Ketu is again not being counted for argala. Sorry, I got a little confused as to what kind of point I was looking to make there. And again, the final step is to, see the special karakas and what happens in the disposition from those. We saw Catherine Zeta-Jones's chart again, where she rose to great fame and success in her Virgo period, but also married, because the 7th from there contains the moon. So let me just show you another example of this here. This woman is a chart of an Indian woman who married in her Scorpio period. And the way this can be, is that right? No, she married in her Taurus period. Sorry about that. So if we, one of the ways in which we use this dasha is to always use the sign of the dasha as a lagna. I think I was talking about this a little bit last week as well. So the sign, is Taurus that she's running. And so we use Taurus as if it's the 1st house, as if it's a lagna. And we see the dispositions of the planets from there. And we see the different influences and where the karakas fall. So in this case, if you put your finger on Taurus and use it as a lagna, then you'll see that in the 7th house from there, you have the sun, then you also have Venus, natural significator of marriage, and then you also have Venus as the DK, special Jaimini Karaka related to spouse, and it was therefore in her Taurus period that she married. The actual sub-period was Capricorn, and you'll see here that in Navamsha from Capricorn, Venus, natural significator again, falls in the 7th from there. It was also the DK in her chart. So this is how this event could be seen in her life. So this is the, there's a very famous movie star. If you come from India, you're going to know who it is, Amitabh Bachchan, right? His father was actually quite a famous poet. And, I looked at the timing of when he had his famous son, and it was in his Pisces major period. And so, if you use Pisces as a lagna, and you look at the 5th house from there, well, you see that it contains an exalted Jupiter, natural significator of children, but then Jupiter is also the PK of this chart, and just becomes generally strong because, from Pisces, you got this combination of Jupiter, but then the moon is the Lord of the 7th, Lord of the 5th house in the 5th house from there, right? And some of you, if you like old movies from the 30s and the 40s, like me, you may recognize the name of the actress Olivia de Havilland. She was in the very famous American movie Gone with the Wind. She oftentimes played as the romantic lead opposite Errol Flynn in a lot of the action adventure movies that came out in the 30s and the 40s. Then what I want you to see here is that when she married was in her Aquarius period, which of course is the 7th house of her birth chart. But it was also a period where she had children. And the way that could have been rather easily foreseen, I believe, is if you use Aquarius as a lagna, and you see the 5th house from there, you'll see that it contains 4 grahas, so it becomes prominent in that way. But, even more importantly, it contains the PK, the planet with the 5th highest degrees, which clearly shows that in the Aquarius Mahadasha, she could have children during this period, which she did. And you'll see the exact same pattern in the chart of former First Lady Nancy Reagan. You'll see that, if you put your finger on Aquarius again, use it as a lagna, see that the 5th house from there, which would be Gemini, has quite a few grahas again, but one of those grahas being the PK. And it's here this period when she had her first child. Now, parenthetically, later when she became First Lady, when she moved into the White House, when her husband Ronald Reagan was elected president, it happened to be in the major period of Gemini. Look at what house of the birth chart Gemini is. Of course, you'll see it's the 10th house, right? And it contains the AMK that can elevate a person. And AMK is Gemini, as Mercury here, strong in its own sign. It also contains the sun, which, I'll have show me examples of when a person's running the major period of a sign containing the sun. Their significance can increase just because of that. That's going to be particularly so when that sun has some source of strength. Here you'll see that it's going to be getting directional strength here in the 10th house. Mars also getting directional strength. But you'll see here that the sun is also the Karaka MK. And so what happened in her Gemini period, in the same way of Trump's Gemini period containing the MK, she also got to move into a very special house called the White House, right? So you see, how this can play itself out in terms of different levels. Level of natural benefic, level of Karaka natural Karaka significations, and then Chara Karaka significations. You have to, when you think about what a period can bring, you have to start thinking on all those different levels. Okay? And, again, always be looking for underlying sources of strength for planets by seeing their condition in Navamsha. I was highlighting how her sun here has a source of strength in the Rashi, gets directional strength. It's the MK of her chart. If you look at her Navamsha, you'll see that the sun gets an additional source of strength because it's in its exaltation sign in Navamsha. So this is something to always keep in mind as well. So moving on here, I think I've talked a lot about the different things I wanted to do. So when you get this document, I want you to go through it and work through all the examples, some of which I'm showing here, not all of them. And then see if you can apply some of this idea, some of the 7 steps, and walk through the 7 steps in terms of, say, the current Chara Dasha that you're running, or ones that you've had in the past, and see how the principles are playing themselves out. Now, what I've shown you is, you might say, retrospective examples of where, you're looking at these events in the past. Of course, you want to be able to use these principles predictively, and I did so in the case of George W. Bush, when in the election of 2000, I had predicted, say, 6 or 8 months before the election that I thought he was going to win, and some of that prediction was based on what I was seeing in his chart from the Jaimini point of view. And one way we want to do that is, again, see Jaimini Raja Yogas, which I haven't talked about yet, but I can kind of explain here. I saw, for example, that he was running the major period of Libra when he was contesting this election. And I've made the point that one of the things we want to see, or one of the ways we use Chara Dasha, is to use it as a Lagna. So make Libra the Lagna here. Look at what happens to the chart. You'll see how strong and powerful the 10th house becomes from there. And if we see, we have 2 benefics, 1 malefic, but we also will see that these planets form, as we see when we do the lesson on Jaimini Raja Yogas, we see that it forms multiple Jaimini Raja Yogas. And, just based on this, I was seeing that it looked like the period was very strong. Now, all these 7 steps that can be applied for seeing the potentials of a major period, these can also be applied to sub-periods as well. So in the case of this American woman here, focus in on the major period of Leo. Now, 2 things you should notice here. First of all, it has the sun strong in its own sign. So again, if you just think about the natural significations of the sun and how it can make you more significant, be a time when you could shine more, there's that level of interpretation. But then the other level of interpretation is that it's the decay of her chart, so it becomes eligible for bringing relationship, even marriage, into her life. It happens to be there with the AMK, Mercury, and then think of the Karaka significations that I've talked about, a period when a person can be more successful, it can elevate a person. So these potentials could be seen for her Leo period just based on these factors. But, if she's going to marry in her Leo period, which because it's the sun in its own sign is going to be 12 years, then it becomes a question of what sub-period that's likely to happen in. And when I show you how marriage gets timed in the Jaimini system, you'll see that the sign 7th from it, from where then the decay would fall in the 7th from there, becomes very eligible. And she did, in fact, marry in the sub-period of Aquarius. If I'm remembering this example correctly, I am here based on what I just saw in my notes. So, when you're wanting to time an event and it's a 12-year period, it's not sufficient just to say, well, this 12-year period is going to bring marriage. Not a very satisfying kind of statement to you. When you want to dial into particular sub-periods then that would become more eligible for giving that, and one of those in this case would be Aquarius, because from Aquarius then the decay is now going to fall in the 7th, and there are 1-7 axes from each other. But we'll see more about this when we go through the lesson of timing marriage. Now, I'm showing you the chart of Jodie Foster, famous American actress, and she had 2 children, and both of these children came into her life. She had them in her Aries period. I'm sorry, you're in a Leo period. Leo period. And if we look at Leo, one thing we notice about it immediately is that it contains the moon, right? But what Karaka for her chart is this moon, and we see that it's the PK. Therefore, it becomes eligible in that sense to bring children. And if we think about a potential subperiod where that might happen, when I show you how children get timed, we could see that if we use Aries as a logna, as a subperiod, using it as a logna again, then we see that the fifth house from Aries is Leo, containing the PK, and she did, in fact, give birth to her first child in the major period of Leo, subperiod of Aries. Now, you may also notice that Aries gets aspected by the natural Putrakaraka of the chart, which, of course, is Jupiter. This is another reason why the Aries subperiod becomes eligible for bringing this event. Her second child actually came in Leo, period and subperiod of the sign containing the PK. So I think I used the chart of John Kennedy in the previous lesson to illustrate this, so I'm not talking about that. So now here in this section of the document that you'll get to review on your own, I go through some more examples of this principle that I was talking about, how just running the sign containing the sun, or in some cases where the sun's falling 10th, just that alone can be, and especially if the sun has some sort of strength, just that alone can make this a strong period. Showing the chart here of Britney Spears, so-called Princess of Pop, who first became so in her Scorpio Mahadasha. And you'll see here it contains the sun, but if you know how to calculate a planet's position in Navamsha based on its degrees at 1626 here, you'll recognize that it's Vargotama. So it's a Vargotama sun. And it's the third house of her birth chart. Of course, the house we've talked about being the house of performance. Gets the influence of a number of grahas. It's got the sun and Mercury in it, but then gets the aspect of a Vargotama Venus and also the moon. BK, like unto the third house again. And it was in this period that she, at a very young age, 17 or 18, when she first entered the period, that she became this big pop music star. What I'm showing you here is that one of the ways in which that can be indicated is just by virtue of the fact that she's got a Vargotama sun there. It can be a period where she becomes a star or more of a star, where she can shine more. And that would be true of anyone, but then if the sun's very strong, and then if it exists within a chart where there are these things, Jaimini Raja Yoga, which is the next lesson, it's going to be even more so. Now, here's a principle I want to talk about that you'll not find in any book on Jaimini, and it's really not something that I was taught at K and Rao. It just came about through my repeated observation, and that is that when you're running the sign period from where there's a very good exchange of planets, then that period can prove special because of that. So you see here that the sun, besides being Vargotama, has another source of strength, because it's involved in an exchange with Mars. There's an exchange between the sun, who goes into Mars' sign, and Mars, who goes into Leo's sign. But if you're using now Scorpio as a lagna, that 7th step in my process, then you're going to see that this is a very highly favorable 1-10 exchange. And in my researches, I've found when you find that to be the case, then that alone should signal you that this can be a highly favorable period that can raise a person up. Of course, if there's other additional factors that bring that about, that's going to be the case. Now, here's another example of this, almost identical to what we just saw with Britney Spears. You've got Indira Gandhi's chart. I discovered that when she first became prime minister, she was prime minister twice. She had the position, lost the position, became prime minister again. But the first time it happened was in her Scorpio Mahadasha, which we see the same thing. We see the sun there, and the sun's not Vargotama this time, but if you saw its position in Navamsha, you'd see that it falls in its own sign. It also is in an exchange with Mars, and from Scorpio as a lagna, it becomes a 1-10 exchange. Mars also has a source of strength because you'll see that it's in the mid-degrees of the fixed sign. It's Vargotama. And there are Raja Yogas again forming, as we'll see when we talk about that next week, within Scorpio. So it was in this major period, for the reasons I just outlined, that it raised her up so high. But I'm highlighting the exchange in this case, right, that's happening from there. Now, we see some similar type of thing going on here in the chart of the current world chess champion, Magnus Carlsen. First of all, it was again in his Scorpio period, the third house of his chart, and again, third house rules games and sports, that he first became a child prodigy in chess, the youngest grandmaster up till that time, but then also it was this period that he became the world champion. And think about what we see here for a moment, or what you would see and make note of based on things that I've outlined. First of all, it contains the sun again, but it also contains Venus, natural benefic, who happens in this case to be the AMK, right? And then if we look at the influences on there by Rashi Drishti, we're going to see that Jupiter over there in Cancer, or in its exaltation sign, as the BK aspects onto this configuration, adding to it. And then when we consider other sources of strength for Venus, the AMK, what do you see going on here between Venus and Mars? You'll note that they're exchanging, and the exchange is a favorable 1-7 exchange. Becomes a source of strength for both of them, but it's a favorable exchange using Scorpio as a Mahadasha. So, all these principles that we've talked about so far, you see them playing itself out with regards to Magnus Carlsen's Scorpio period when he became the chess reigning champion. So now I'm showing the chart of Woody Allen, right? And he also became famous as a comic, and his initial movies came about in his Scorpio period. And again, we see some similar those things we've seen in Scorpio periods of others. First of all, this time the sun is the sun is his AMK this time, and you'll see if you look at its degrees, mid degrees of Scorpio, fifth Navamsha of Scorpio, it's going to be Vargotam again. Here it's with two natural benefics, one of whom is the BK, like unto performance again, and so you see that these examples here all have some commonality. And it's during these periods that Scorpio periods prove to be very, very special for them. I'm showing you a chart of the very famous actress, movie star, Academy Award winner, Audrey Hepburn. She initially got her initial success and great fame coming in her Aries period. So now contemplate what you see in her Aries period. The first thing you should note is that there's an exalted sun, right, who also happens to be the BK. It is with a natural benefic, Jupiter, who happens to be, in this case, the AMK. And something I haven't mentioned yet, but when you see, just as in Parashara, if you see some house or sign that has flanked on either side by natural benefics, then that's a very, very good thing for that sign. You'll see in her case, you've got an exalted Venus on one side and Mercury on the other. So what I've been showing you here through these different examples is ways in which those seven steps that I outlined for how we evaluate some of the potentials in anybody's Chara Dasha. Now, of course, I'm showing you dramatic examples of people who ran periods where they achieved great success and fame. But you can also predict on these bases. So I'm going to, when you send you this document, let you look at these rest of the examples on your own. I'm going to conclude today's lesson by doing what I call real life astrology. That is, I'm showing you something with regards to a chart of a non-celebrity person. And let me get the chart up here before I talk about it further. Just take me a moment here. And I need to get rid of the name here. Okay, so you should be seeing this chart here both in the North and South Indian style. Maybe not yet. I need to reshare my screen. All right, you should be seeing it now. Right? So this is a chart of someone well known to me, a woman friend, who I've been giving astrological input to for since 1999, so a pretty long time. And it was just this morning that she called me, and she had a very specific question. She was considering buying property, and she wanted to know if there were any indications in her chart where that may be the case. And so the first way in which I looked at this, and her time frame was, starting in the spring of this year was the time frame that she was looking at. And so the first thing I did was to see what Chara Dasha she was running. And I discovered that she was running her Aries period. So now think about that. Which house of the horoscope is this? You see, of course, that it's her fourth house, having to do with home and property. Now, you might also see, if you calculate the length of this period, that it's a very short period, because the counting would start from Aries and it would go forward in the zodiac. Mars is just one sign away, so it's 1, 2, minus 1. So the period's very short. It's just a year, and is going to be running up until, I believe, the fall of this year. So that certainly was a positive indication for the potential for this. But then I wanted to see the sub-period that coincided to the time frame which she would potentially purchase and become the owner of this home. And I discovered that the sub-period would have been coinciding with her Sagittarius sub-period within Aries. And so you look to see what of the grahas are there and which ones they are. So you see here that it contains 3 grahas, Saturn, Moon, and Jupiter, one of whom is the MK of her chart, like unto the 4th house, 4th lord. And so based on this, and then cross-checking that in indications in the Parashari system, and then even thinking about transits, Jupiter from transiting in Virgo is going to make its Parashari aspect onto the 4th lord Mars. That's where Jupiter is currently in Virgo, and even Saturn here from Sagittarius, starting in early April, is going to be running retrograde. In which case, according to a principle that Sri Rao uses, that retrograde planets will aspect as if from the sign before. It's going to be aspecting as if from Scorpio, therefore also again onto the 4th lord Mars. The point I'm making here is the simultaneous aspect of Jupiter and Saturn onto the 4th lord Mars, which is another technique taught by Sri Rao for utilizing transits and timing events. The upshot of all this is that the indications were actually fairly good, both in Jaimini and Parashari and through transits, that she would acquire property in this time frame, which is the prediction that I gave her. And so we have to wait a few months to see how it comes out. But again, I want to show you sort of a straightforward example of how a prediction came out very simply, or how it was made very simply based on Jaimini's system and the use of Chara Dasha. So, along with this video presentation, you'll be getting the written document, the lesson that I recommend that everyone go through in detail as preparation for the next lesson. But we'll end this one, as we will end all lessons, with another Sanskrit prayer. Om Masato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Sarvesham Swasti Bhavatu Sarvesham Shanti Bhavatu Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So namaste, everyone, and so until we meet again, I wish everyone well. Bye for now.